Welcome, Roman emperors. Welcome to another night of boring stories for sleep. Tonight, we rest to the soft sounds of blades crashing and soldiers falling, because nothing says peaceful sleep like the rise and fall of an empire, right? Before we get into our story, if you truly enjoy this content, please like this video, comment, and subscribe. Let me know where you are tuning in from and what time it is. It is always fascinating to see where others are tuning in from across the world. Now, get comfortable. Enjoy the light sound of the fire crackling. Maybe turn on some white noise to calm your mind, okay? And let's talk about the fall of an empire. The story of Rome begins not with marble, legions, and emperors, but with a tale told by firesides and epic of twins, abandoned, a she-wolf, and destiny itself. The Romans traced their lineage to the gods, weaving their national identity from myth as much as from blood. According to tradition, it was in 753 BC that Romulus, after a quarrel with his brother Remus, staked the first lines of a city on the banks of the Tiber. He gave it his name, and Rome was born. From the start, violence and ambition marked its foundation. The story of Romulus killing Remus spoke to the Roman soul, brother against brother, order forged through blood. Early Romans believed their city was chosen by fate, not chance. As they grew from shepherds and farmers into a people of war and politics, their legends gave them a sense of divine mission. Rome, in its infancy, was little more than huts of mud and thatch perched above a swampy plain. Yet the landscape worked in its favor. The 7 hills gave natural fortification, and the river provided both water and access to the sea. Surrounded by rival tribes, the Sabines, Etruscans, and Latins, Rome had no choice but to fight, negotiate, and adapt. This constant struggle became part of the Roman character. The earliest kings ruled with absolute power, drawing on the influence of neighboring civilizations. The Etruscans, with their advanced engineering and religious rituals, left a heavy mark on Rome. From them came the use of the arch, gladiatorial contests, and the discipline of augurating the will of the gods through the flight of birds. Daily life for ordinary Romans in this early period was simple and harsh. Families lived in cramped dwellings, often centered around a hearth. Food was coarse bread, porridge, olive sand. Life expectancy was short. Yet the Romans valued discipline, loyalty, and family above all. The household was governed by the pater familias, the male head of the family, who held power of life and death over his wife, children, and slaves. This sense of strict hierarchy within the family mirrored the structure of Roman society itself. To be Roman meant to be bound by duty, first to one's household, then to the state, and finally to the gods. By the late 6th century BC, discontent simmered under the rule of the Tarquin kings. The last, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus Tarquin, the Proud, became infamous for his tyranny. According to tradition, his downfall was triggered not by politics, but by personal outrage. His son's assault of a noble woman, Lucretia, led to her suicide and sparked a revolution. The Roman elite, unwilling to suffer further under monarchical arrogance, swore an oath never again to be ruled by a king. In 509 BC, they cast out Tarquin and founded the Republic. This moment was transformative. No longer subject to a single ruler, Rome became governed by elected magistrates and a senate drawn from its aristocracy. The Romans called their new system res publicator, government belonging to the people. Power was divided among 2 annually elected consuls, who commanded the army and presided over the state. Yet real influence rested with the Senate, whose members served for life and came from Rome's patrician elite. Life in the early republic was defined by tension between patricians, the wealthy landowning class, and plebeians, the common people. The plebeians farmed, fought, and paid taxes, but they had little voice in government. For generations, they pushed for rights, walking out of the city in protest, refusing to fight until they were granted concessions. From these struggles arose the office of tribune of the plebs, a representative who could veto unjust laws. Rome's political system became a balance of competing interests, a patchwork of compromises designed to prevent the return of tyranny. Meanwhile, the city itself grew more sophisticated. Streets were laid, temples rose to Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, and the Forum became the bustling heart of Roman life. Traders filled the markets with wine, olive oil, and goods from across Italy. Citizens gathered to debate, to worship, or to watch public games. Religion infused every aspect of daily life. Romans believed the gods oversaw their state, rewarding virtue and punishing impiety. Before any major decision, whether a marriage, a military campaign, or the construction of a building, priest sought divine approval through rituals and sacrifices. As Rome expanded its influence, it clashed with neighboring tribes and cities. Wars with the Latin League and the Etruscans hardened its armies and sharpened its political unity. The Roman legions were unlike any other force in the Mediterranean. Citizen soldiers served out of duty, organizing themselves into maniples that allowed flexibility in battle. Discipline and training made them formidable. Victory brought spoils and land, but defeat meant devastation. Every Roman family lived with the weight of military service, and the graves of young men lined the countryside. The conquest of Veii in 396 BC marked Rome's first great triumph. This wealthy Etruscan city fell after a long siege, and its territory doubled Rome's domain. Yet triumph soon turned to terror. In 390 BC, a band of Gauls swept into Italy, defeating Rome at the Battle of the Ilia and sacking the city. The horror of foreign soldiers looting their homes left a scar on the Roman psyche. Though they rebuilt, the memory of that humiliation fueled Rome's determination never again to let their city fall. Through hardship and resilience, Rome transformed from a vulnerable town into a rising power. Citizens worked their small plots, women spun wool, slaves toiled in households and fields, and magistrates argued in the Forum. Children were taught to honor their ancestors, to speak plainly, and to endure hardship without complaint. Roman virtues, gravitas, seriousness, pietas, duty to gods and family, caring, were instilled from an early age. By the 3rd century BC, Rome stood ready to extend its reach far beyond its hills. Its people had learned to endure tyranny, to overthrow it, and to build a republic that combined ambition with pragmatism. The stage was set for wars that would bring them into conflict with the great powers of the Mediterranean, and for the rise of leaders whose names would echo for millennia. The Republic had been born from the expulsion of kings, but it carried within it both the promise of liberty and the seeds of eventual empire. Birth of empire and Pax Romana, the Republic, though strong, was never without cracks. As Rome expanded across Italy and then beyond, wealth and power poured into the city, straining the balance between patricians and plebeians. Victories brought treasures, slaves, and fertile land, but they also brought inequality. Great estates, the latifundia, consumed the countryside, worked by armies of slaves captured from foreign wars. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens struggled to maintain their small farms, often leaving them behind when called to war. The ideals of shared duty began to falter as ambition, greed, and faction took hold. Rome's expansion into the wider Mediterranean set the stage for greatness. The Punic Wars against Carthage tested the Republic's resolve. In 264 BC, Rome fought its first overseas war, a brutal struggle for control of Sicily. The Carthaginians, masters of the sea, faced Roman ingenuity. With little naval experience, Rome built a fleet from scratch, equipping their ships with boarding bridges called corvi, allowing their infantry to turn naval battles into land battles at sea. Against all odds, Rome triumphed. Yet, the war was only the beginning. Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, became one of the most feared names in Roman history. In 218 BC, he led his army, complete with elephants, across the Alps, a feat of daring that stunned the world. At Cannae, Hannibal inflicted one of the worst defeats Rome had ever known, circling and slaughtering tens of thousands of Roman soldiers. Panic swept the Republic, but Rome refused to yield. Through years of attrition, stubborn defense, and the eventual counterattack of Scipio Africanus, Rome forced Carthage to its knees. By the end of the Punic Wars, Carthage was destroyed, and Rome emerged as the supreme power of the Western Mediterranean. Its legions now moved freely across Spain, North Africa, and Greece, but the cost of victory was heavy. Veterans returned to find their farms ruined, their places taken by wealthy elites. The gulf between rich and poor widened, feeding unrest that simmered for generations. Amid this turmoil, powerful generals began to eclipse the authority of the Senate. Men like Gaius Marius reformed the army, allowing landless citizens to enlist. Soldiers now looked to their commanders, rather than the Republic itself, for rewards and security. This bond between general and legion would shape the coming century, turning Rome from a republic of laws into an empire of men. The Republic staggered under waves of civil wars. The Gracchi brothers attempted reforms to redistribute land and ease poverty, but both were murdered, their deaths marking a turn toward bloodshed in politics. Rival generals clashed for power, dragging the Republic into chaos. Sulla marched his army on Rome itself, a shocking violation of sacred tradition, and set a precedent for military dictatorship. From this maelstrom emerged Julius Caesar, a brilliant general and master of politics. Caesar expanded Rome's territories in Gaul, defeating tribal leaders and securing immense wealth and prestige. His writings, still preserved, captured not only his campaigns, but also the sharp intellect and ambition that drove him. 8. Caesar's rising power threatened the Senate. When he crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BC with his loyal legions, he made his choice clear. Rome would bow to his authority, or it would burn in civil war. The war that followed ended with Caesar triumphant. He declared himself dictator for life, centralizing power in his hands. For some Romans, weary of endless conflict, this seemed a blessing. He enacted reforms, reduced debts, and planned vast public works. But to others, his authority was a betrayal of the Republic's very essence. On the Ides of March in 44 BC, senators struck him down in the theater of Pompey, believing they were saving liberty. Instead, they plunged Rome into yet another cycle of bloodshed. Key, in the years that followed, Caesar's assassins fell, and his chosen heir, Octavian, rose. Through cunning alliances and ruthless determination, Octavian defeated his rivals, including Mark Antony and Cleopatra of Egypt. In 27 BC, he presented himself not as a tyrant, but as the restorer of peace. The Senate granted him the title Augustus, and the Roman Empire was born. Augustus mastered the delicate balance of appearances. He claimed to restore the Republic, yet in truth, he held supreme power as princeps, the first citizen. He controlled the legions, the treasury, and the provinces. He cloaked monarchy in republican forms, ensuring his rule endured without the title of king. Under Augustus, Rome entered an era that would be remembered as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. The empire stretched from Spain to Syria, from the Rhine to the Nile. Roads and aqueducts knit its vast territories together, allowing goods, soldiers, and ideas to flow as never before. Rome itself became a city of marble, as Augustus famously declared. Temples gleamed in the sun, forums bustled with merchants and philosophers, and amphitheaters roared with the voices of thousands. The Colosseum, begun later under the Flavians, would become the symbol of Roman grandeur, hosting spectacles of blood and glory. Life in this new empire reflected both continuity and change. The old virtues of discipline and family remained, yet luxury crept into daily routines. Roman citizens enjoyed baths, theaters, and lavish banquets, while slaves labored unseen to sustain their master's comfort. The household still revolved around the paterfamilias, but the influence of powerful women, like Livia, Augustus's wife, hinted at the subtler roles women played in shaping politics and society. Religion also remained central. The gods of old Jupiter, Juno, Mars were honored, but Augustus introduced the cult of the emperor. He positioned himself as the guardian of Rome's destiny, his image stamped on coins and his authority sanctified by divine favor. For ordinary citizens, loyalty to Rome and to the emperor became inseparable. Despite the empire's grandeur, challenges lingered. The frontier legions stood watch against restless tribes. Corruption crept into provincial administration, and the memory of civil war haunted every generation. Yet for 2 centuries, Rome enjoyed relative stability. Its citizens proud of their empire, its enemies wary of its legions. The Republic was gone, replaced by a system where power lay in the hands of a single man. But Rome thrived as never before. Its people lived in the largest city the world had yet seen, a metropolis of over 1 million souls. Its markets overflowed with spices from Arabia, silk from China, and grain from Egypt. Citizens bathed in aqueduct-fed waters, strolled through marble forums, and prayed for fortune in temples that seemed to touch the heavens. Rome had become more than a city. It was the heart of a world-spanning empire. Its legions, the steel that held it together. Its culture, the thread that bound diverse peoples under a single rule. The rise of Augustus marked both the end of the Republic and the dawn of something greater, something destined to shape history for centuries to come. Golden Age in shadows. After Augustus, Rome entered a rhythm of succession that was at times smooth and at times turbulent. Some emperors proved wise, others disastrous, but the foundations laid by Augustus allowed the empire to endure. The early imperial dynasty gave way to the Julio-Claudians, whose reigns included the infamous Nero, and then to the Flavians, who built the Colosseum. By the 2nd century AD, Rome reached what many historians would call its golden age. This was the era of the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus, Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Their reigns, stretching from 96 to 180 AD, represented stability and relative prosperity. Each ruler was chosen not by bloodline alone, but by adoption, selecting capable heirs who could govern with wisdom. The empire expanded to its greatest territorial extent under Trajan, stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. It was a time when Rome seemed invincible, its legions unchallenged, its cities thriving, its citizens proud of belonging to the mightiest empire the world had ever known. Trajan embodied the image of the soldier emperor, beloved by his troops. He campaigned tirelessly, conquering Dacia in the early 2nd century. The spoils of that conquest filled Rome with wealth and funded monumental projects such as Trajan's Forum and Trajan's Column, which still stands today, spiraling upward with carvings that depict his victories in intricate detail. Rome became a city not just of function, but of spectacle, a place where power expressed itself through stone and marble. Hadrian, his successor, shifted the focus from expansion to consolidation. He traveled across the empire, inspecting provinces, fortifying borders, and ensuring the loyalty of Rome's vast territories. In Britain, he ordered the construction of Hadrian's Wall, a massive frontier fortification that marked the northernmost boundary of Rome. He understood that the empire could not expand indefinitely, and instead sought to strengthen what Rome already held. His love for Greek culture also helped spread Hellenistic influence throughout Roman life, blending traditions and philosophies into a uniquely Roman identity. Life in Rome at this time was dazzling for those who could afford luxury. The city bustled with energy, its population swelling past 1 million. The Forum served as the political and commercial heart, a place of speeches, trade, and legal proceedings. Wealthy Romans lived in spacious homes with courtyards and mosaics, while the poor crowded into insulate, multi-storied apartment blocks that often collapsed or burned. Yet even the poor enjoyed the benefits of empire. Grain from Egypt was distributed to citizens, ensuring that Rome's hungry masses remained fed. Public baths offered hygiene and leisure, while circuses and amphitheaters provided entertainment on a grand scale. The Colosseum became the beating heart of Roman spectacle. Tens of thousands of citizens gathered to watch gladiators fight, wild beasts hunt, and naval battles reenacted with flooded arenas. The crowd roared with bloodlust, yet also with pride, for these games symbolized Rome's power and wealth. To be Roman was to be part of something greater than oneself, bound by loyalty to the emperor in the eternal city. Religion infused every aspect of this golden age. Case, Romans honored their gods through festivals, sacrifices, and rituals. The Vestal Virgins tended the sacred flame, symbolizing Rome's eternal life. Emperors themselves were deified after death, joining the ranks of the divine. Yet, new religious movements also spread, quietly at first. Followers of mystery cults worshipped gods from Egypt and the East, offering personal salvation and hope of life beyond death. Among them, Christianity began its slow growth, often facing persecution, but gaining followers across social classes. Daily life revealed both the grandeur and the hardships of empire. Senators debated policies, merchants traded goods from distant lands, and craftsmen labored in workshops. Slaves were everywhere, forming the backbone of Roman labor. They cooked meals, educated children, built monuments, and fought in arenas. For the wealthy, slavery meant convenience and leisure. But for the enslaved, it meant a life of toil, with freedom only rarely granted. The Roman family remained the foundation of society. The paterfamilias still held ultimate authority, but marriages among the elite were often arranged for political advantage. Women of status could wield considerable influence behind the scenes, managing estates and shaping alliances, though legally they remained under male guardianship. For ordinary families, survival depended on hard work and adherence to Roman values of duty, honor, and piety. Yet, beneath the surface of prosperity, shadows lengthened. Even in this golden age, the seeds of decline were sown. The empire's vast size required constant vigilance, and maintaining distant frontiers drained resources. Wealth concentrated in the hands of the elite, while the poor grew increasingly dependent on state handouts. The reliance on slave labor stifled innovation, for why invent new tools when endless human labor could be exploited? Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5 good emperors, embodied both the heights and the fragility of Rome. A philosopher king, he wrote meditations that reflected a stoic belief in duty, self-control, and acceptance of fate. He ruled with wisdom, but his reign was plagued by challenges. Germanic tribes pressed against the northern borders, and a devastating plague swept through the empire, killing millions. Though Marcus fought tirelessly to preserve stability, his choice of heir would undo much of his legacy. His son, Commodus, inherited the throne not by merit, but by blood. Unlike his father, Commodus reveled in excess and sought glory not on battlefields, but in the Colosseum, where he styled himself as a gladiator emperor. The Senate despised him, the people mocked him, and the empire began its long slide from gold to rust. The golden age of Rome was a time of triumph, of monuments and conquests, of philosophy and culture. Yet it also marked the beginning of decline. As citizens enjoyed the fruits of empire, they grew complacent, trusting in the eternal strength of Rome. Few could imagine that within a few centuries, the city that called itself eternal would be humbled, invaded, and transformed. The grandeur of the 5 good emperors cast a long shadow, and in that shadow, Rome's fate slowly began to shift. Commodus, in the start of decline. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, the empire stood at a crossroads. His reign had been one of discipline and thought, shaped by the Stoic ideals he recorded in his private writings. Yet, his decision to leave the throne to his son, Commodus, marked a departure from the careful system of adoption that had produced capable rulers for nearly a century. The transition from philosopher king to gladiator emperor proved disastrous, and historians ever since have marked this moment as the beginning of Rome's long decline. Commodus was only 19 when he inherited the empire, and unlike his father, he had little interest in philosophy, governance, or military discipline. Instead, he sought pleasure, spectacle, and adoration. Where Marcus Aurelius had embodied duty, Commodus embodied indulgence. He reveled in the trappings of power, presenting himself as the living embodiment of Hercules, often depicted in statues with a lion's skin and club. The people of Rome, weary of wars and hungry for entertainment, at first welcomed Commodus's flamboyance. He poured resources into public games, personally appearing in the Colosseum to fight wild beasts and even gladiators. Though these contests were staged for his safety, the spectacle of an emperor lowering himself into the arena shocked the Senate and outraged Rome's elite. To them, Commodus diminished the dignity of the office, turning imperial authority into a theatrical performance. In truth, Commodus was less a tyrant than a ruler uninterested in the hard work of governance. He entrusted administration to favorites and freedmen, many of whom exploited their positions for personal gain. Corruption spread through the empire as bribes determined appointments, justice bent to wealth, and the treasury emptied into the hands of sycophants. The Senate, once the guiding council of Rome, was reduced to a powerless body, resenting the emperor, yet unable to act. Beyond the city, cracks widened in the empire's stability. On the frontiers, legions faced constant threats from Germanic tribes pressing against the Rhine and Danube. Commodus showed little interest in leading campaigns himself, preferring the comfort of Rome. Instead, he signed hasty treaties or left generals to manage crises without support. The discipline of the legions, once Rome's greatest strength, began to waver under inconsistent leadership. Daily life in Rome reflected both the extravagance of the emperor and the strain of his neglect. The games grew ever more lavish, consuming vast sums of money, while public services faltered. Grain distributions became unreliable, aqueducts fell into disrepair, and fires broke out in crowded districts of the city. For the poor, who depended on bread and entertainment, life became precarious. For the wealthy, who watched their influence fade under imperial whim, resentment grew. Commodus's behavior became increasingly erratic. Convinced of his divine nature, he renamed Rome itself Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus, and the months of the calendar after his own titles. His paranoia deepened, leading him to execute senators and nobles on suspicion of conspiracy. Fear gripped the city as accusations became tools for settling old grudges and eliminating rivals. The emperor, who once amused the people in the arena, now frightened them with his cruelty. In 192 AD, Commodus announced plans to appear in the Colosseum on New Year's Day as a gladiator, tending to mark a new golden age under his rule. For many, this was the final insult. A conspiracy formed among members of his inner circle, including his mistress and the Praetorian prefect. On the night of December 31st, Commodus was strangled in his bath by an athlete named Narcissus. His death ended the line of Marcus Aurelius and plunged Rome into turmoil. The Senate quickly declared Commodus a public enemy and sought to restore dignity to the empire, but the damage was done. His reign had revealed the fragility of imperial power, dependent not on institutions, but on the character of one man. With his assassination, the empire entered the year of the 5 emperors, a violent struggle in which generals and politicians vied for control. Civil war erupted as armies declared loyalty to competing claimants. For the first time since Augustus, the empire seemed unstable, its fate uncertain. The turmoil of this period highlighted the empire's growing reliance on the military. Whoever commanded the legions commanded Rome, Emperors rose and fell at the whim of soldiers, whose loyalty could be bought with donatives, large sums of money paid in exchange for support. Political power shifted from the Senate and the people to the camps of generals, a dangerous trend that eroded the unity of the state. In the provinces, ordinary citizens felt the weight of uncertainty. Taxes increased to pay for endless campaigns, and trade routes became vulnerable to raids. Farmers faced both military requisitions and banditry, while cities endured shortages and inflation. Though the empire remained vast and powerful, its stability was shaken. The memory of Commodus lingered as a symbol of how quickly greatness could falter when rulers abandoned discipline. Yet Rome was not finished. Timius Severus, a general from North Africa who seized power in 193 AD and founded the Severian dynasty. He restored a measure of stability, strengthening the army and expanding Rome's frontiers in Mesopotamia. But the lesson of Commodus remained clear. Emperors who ruled poorly could bring the empire to the brink, and military might had become the final arbiter of political power. The transition from Marcus Aurelius to Commodus marked more than the death of one man and the rise of another. It marked the end of an era of stability, the end of the Golden Age, and the beginning of a long struggle that would test Rome's resilience. The philosopher king had passed, the gladiator emperor had fallen, and the empire moved forward, forever changed by the shadows they left behind. Crisis of the 3rd century, the death of Commodus, and the rise of Septimius Severus did not heal the empire's wounds. Although Severus restored order for a time, his reign and those of his successors revealed a troubling truth. Rome's stability no longer rested on the Senate or civic institutions, but on the loyalty of soldiers. The emperor had become a commander-in-chief above all else, and to secure power, he needed the army's favor. This dependence came at a steep cost, for soldiers expected lavish rewards in return. Draining the treasury and deepening divisions within society, the Severian dynasty, which held power into the early 3rd century, brought both expansion and corruption. Severus himself strengthened the army, raising soldiers' pay and recruiting men from across the provinces. His sons, Caracalla and Geta, inherited a militarized empire. Caracalla granted Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire in 212 AD. Quaint, a sweeping act that unified the empire legally, but also increased tax revenues. Yet, Caracalla ruled with brutality. He murdered his brother Geta in front of their mother, and spent much of his reign campaigning in the east before being assassinated by his own guards. In the decades that followed, assassination became a recurring fate of emperors. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome saw more than 20 emperors rise and fall, many reigning for only a year or two before being killed in battle or betrayed by their soldiers. Historians call this period the crisis of the 3rd century, a time when the empire nearly collapsed under the weight of civil war, economic breakdown, plague, and invasion. The crisis began in 235 AD with the death of Severus Alexander, who was murdered by his troops on the Rhine frontier. His failure to satisfy the army's demands sparked a cycle of usurpation. Generals, proclaimed emperor by their legions, marched on Rome to seize the throne. Rarely did these rulers survive long. Each was challenged by rivals, their reigns ending in defeat or betrayal. Political power had become fragmented, shifting with the tide of battle. While emperors fought each other, Rome's enemies pressed hard on its borders. Germanic tribes raided across the Rhine and Danube, burning towns and enslaving citizens. In the east, the Sassanid Persian Empire emerged as a formidable rival, defeating Roman armies and capturing the Emperor Valerian in 260 AD. His humiliating fate, paraded in chains by the Persians, shocked the world and revealed Rome's vulnerability. As central authority crumbled, the empire fractured. In the west, the Gallic Empire broke away, encompassing Gaul, Spain, and Britain. In the east, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra carved out her own dominion, ruling over Syria and Egypt with remarkable ambition. For a time, the Roman Empire seemed doomed to permanent division. Its unity lost to regional powers. Daily life during the crisis reflected this chaos. Cities that had flourished under the Pax Romana faced decline. Trade routes became dangerous, cutting off supplies of grain, spices, and luxury goods. Inflation soared as emperors debased the currency, minting coins with less silver to pay their soldiers. Farmers abandoned their land under the burden of taxes and raids, while urban populations shrank. Disease, including outbreaks of plague, further weakened communities, killing thousands and leaving fields untended. Despite the turmoil, Roman resilience endured. Carthage, though often divided by loyalty to competing emperors, continued to defend the empire's frontiers with determination. Ordinary citizens adapted to hardship, clinging to the traditions and rituals that bound them together. Families continued to honor the gods, celebrate festivals, teach their children Roman values, even as the state around them faltered. Among the emperors of this troubled century, a few stood out for their efforts to restore stability. Gallienus, though beset by crises, reformed the army, creating a mobile cavalry force that could respond quickly to threats. Aurelian, who reigned from 270 to 275, became known as Res Dictator Orbis, or King, the Restorer of the World. He defeated both the Gallic Empire in the west and Zenobia's Palmyrene Empire in the east, reuniting Rome under a single rule. He also fortified the capital itself, building the massive Aurelian walls that still stand today. A recognition that Rome could no longer rely solely on distant legions for protection. Aurelian's reign, though brief, offered a glimpse of recovery. Yet he too fell victim to assassination, killed by his own officers. The cycle of violence seemed endless. Emperors who restored order were undone by conspiracy, while weaker rulers invited chaos. For nearly 50 years, Rome tottered between survival and collapse, its vast size and wealth both a blessing and a burden. For citizens living through the crisis, hope must have seemed dim. Farmers along the frontiers lived in fear of raids, their crops trampled and their families carried off by invaders. Merchants struggled as coinage lost value, their profits vanishing in a flood of worthless currency. Even the nobility, once secure in their estates and influence, faced confiscations, conscription, and the constant threat of shifting loyalties. Yet, even in darkness, Rome's identity endured. The Latin language, Roman law, and the shared memory of past greatness bound the empire together. Temples still stood, aqueducts still carried water, and the idea of Rome as eternal still lived in the minds of its people. The crisis tested Rome as never before, but it also revealed a resilience that would pave the way for eventual recovery. By the late 3rd century, a new leader would rise to confront the chaos. Diocletian, a soldier of humble origins, seized power in 284 AD and began a sweeping reorganization of the empire. His reforms would bring temporary stability, but also transform Rome in ways that made it very different from the Republic and early empire. The crisis had shown that the old system could no longer endure. Rome would survive, but it would not remain the same. The crisis of the 3rd century was a turning point, a reminder that no empire, however mighty, is immune to weakness. Civil wars, plagues, invasions, and economic collapse nearly destroyed Rome. Yet, the empire endured, scarred but not broken. Its survival owed much to the stubbornness of its people, the discipline of its armies, and the vision of leaders who refused to let the eternal city fall. Diocletian and the Tetrarchy. By the late 3rd century, Rome had survived near collapse, but survival alone was not enough. The empire's wounds were deep, and without reform, it would not endure. When Diocletian, a soldier of humble origin from Dalmatia, seized power in 284 AD, he understood that the empire could not be ruled as it once had been. The days of a single emperor presiding over a sprawling dominion were gone. The empire was simply too vast, too threatened on too many frontiers, and two divided by its own ambitions. To save Rome, Diocletian would rebuild it. Diocletian was pragmatic, a man shaped by years in the army. He recognized that authority had to be strong, visible, and absolute. The old illusion of republican forms had long since faded. He declared himself dominus, lord and master, marking a new style of monarchy historians later called the dominate. Where Augustus had cloaked his power in humility, Diocletian embraced open authority. To see the emperor was now a rare privilege. Ceremonies elevated him above ordinary mortals, and subjects bowed before him. The emperor was no longer first among equals, but a figure set apart. The most significant of Diocletian's reforms was the creation of the Tetrarchy, the rule of four. In 293 AD, he divided the empire into two halves, east and west, each governed by an Augustus and assisted by a junior emperor, a Caesar. Diocletian ruled the east from Nicomedia, while his compeer Maximian ruled the west from Milan. Each Augustus appointed a Caesar who would succeed them, ensuring continuity. This system was designed to provide stability, share the burden of defense, and prevent usurpation by ambitious generals. For a time, the Tetrarchy worked. The empire's borders were strengthened, invasions repelled, and provinces administered more effectively. The East, with its wealth and trade routes, flourished under Diocletian's careful oversight. The West, though more vulnerable to barbarian incursions, benefited from Maximian's campaigns. Citizens saw renewed security, and the legions regained confidence under firm leadership. The empire seemed, at last, to have found a way forward. Diocletian also undertook sweeping reforms of administration and economy. The empire was divided into smaller provinces, grouped into dioceses, allowing closer governance and less opportunity for corruption. Bureaucracy expanded, ensuring tighter control of taxes and resources. To address rampant inflation, Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 AD, attempting to fix wages and the cost of goods. Though well-intentioned, the edict was nearly impossible to enforce and often ignored, but it reflected the scale of economic challenges Rome faced. Religion, too, fell under Diocletian's stern hand. Although tolerant of many cults, he viewed Christianity with suspicion. Its refusal to honor traditional gods and the emperor's divine authority struck at the heart of Roman unity. In 303 AD, Diocletian launched the Great Persecution, the harshest attempt to suppress Christianity in Rome's history. Churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, and Christians arrested, tortured, or executed if they refused to sacrifice to the gods. For many, this was a time of terror and martyrdom. Yet, rather than extinguishing the faith, the persecution strengthened it, inspiring devotion and defiance. Daily life under Diocletian reflected the growing rigidity of imperial control. Farmers were bound to their land, their status inherited by their children. A measure designed to secure food production, but one that foreshadowed medieval serfdom. Craftsmen were tied to their professions, ensuring a steady supply of goods for the army and state. For ordinary citizens, these policies meant less freedom but greater stability. Markets continued to operate, cities bustled, and the sense of order returned after decades of chaos. Diocletian's reforms also reshaped the role of the army. He expanded the number of legions, creating mobile field units alongside frontier garrisons. Fortifications were strengthened, roads improved, and recruitment broadened to include men from across the provinces. Service in the army remained harsh, but the promise of pay, land, and honor still drew recruits. Soldiers, once the arbiters of imperial succession, now found their loyalty commanded by a more structured hierarchy. In 305 AD, Diocletian did something extraordinary. After 20 years of rule, he voluntarily abdicated, retiring to his palace in Dalmatia, where he spent his remaining years tending gardens. No emperor before him had laid down power willingly. He believed the Tetrarchy would continue as designed, with Caesar's rising to become Augusti and appointing successors in turn. His vision was of an empire led not by one man's ambition, but by a system that could endure. Yet Diocletian underestimated the force of ambition. Within years of his retirement, the tetrarchy unraveled. Caesars and Augusti quarreled. Provinces declared loyalty to rival claimants, and civil wars erupted once again. The dream of four rulers working in harmony proved fragile. By 313 AD, the system had collapsed, replaced by new rivalries that would give rise to Constantine. For the people of Rome, Diocletian's legacy was mixed. On the one hand, he had restored stability after the chaos of the 3rd century, strengthening defenses and reasserting imperial authority. On the other hand, his reforms created a more rigid society where personal freedom was curtailed and bureaucracy weighed heavily on daily life. His persecution of Christians left scars, yet his administrative structures endured for centuries. The division of East and West, though not intended to be permanent, foreshadowed the eventual split of the empire. Even in retirement, Diocletian was remembered with awe. His palace at Split, massive and fortified, symbolized both the grandeur and the severity of his rule. Visitors who sought his return to politics were met with his reply, "If you could show the cabbage I planted with my own hands to your emperor." He would never dare suggest that I replace the peace of this place with the storms of a never-satisfied greed. Diocletian's reign marked the end of the old empire and the beginning of a new, more authoritarian order. The Republic's legacy was long gone, and even the early empire of Augustus seemed distant. In its place stood a state defined by bureaucracy, military might, and the divine authority of its rulers. Rome had survived its great crisis, but the world it entered was one transformed. And the balance between East and West, between old gods and new faith, shifting toward a future no one could yet foresee. Constantine, Christianity, and division. The reforms of Diocletian gave Rome breathing space, but they came at a price. The division of the empire into eastern and western halves, ruled by multiple emperors, created an uneasy balance of power. When Diocletian retired in 305 AD, the tetrarchic system quickly unraveled. Ambitious generals and Caesars turned on one another, plunging Rome once more into civil war. Amid this chaos emerged a figure whose reign would mark one of the most profound transformations in Roman history: Constantine. Constantine was the son of Constantius, one of Diocletian's tetrarchs, and he grew up in the military camps of the empire, a skilled soldier and charismatic leader. He secured the loyalty of his troops in Britain and Gaul. In 36 AD, upon his father's death, the legions declared him emperor. What followed was a long struggle against rivals, as various claimants vied for the purple. Turning point came in 312 AD at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge outside Rome. Constantine, preparing to face his rival Maxentius, reportedly received a vision the night before. He saw a cross of light in the sky with the words in this sign, "Conquer." Inspired, he ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the Christian symbol, the Chiro. The next day, Constantine's army triumphed. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber, and Constantine entered Rome as sole ruler of the Western Empire. This victory was more than military. It marked the moment when Christianity, once a persecuted faith, began its rise to dominance. In 313 AD, Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance throughout the empire. Christians, who had suffered under Diocletian's persecutions, now worshipped openly. Churches sprang up in cities, bishops gained influence, and the once marginal sect began to shape Roman society. Constantine himself embraced Christianity, though his conversion was gradual. He supported the church with patronage, exempted clergy from certain taxes, and endowed basilicas, including the original St. Peter's in Rome. Yet he also retained pagan titles and rituals, navigating the delicate balance between old traditions and new faith. For Rome's citizens, this blending was jarring. Its temples still stood. Sacrifices still filled the air with smoke. but crosses now appeared beside them, symbols of a shifting spiritual order. The new religion brought changes to daily life. Sunday became a day of rest. Christian clergy grew in authority, and moral teachings spread through towns and villages. Families baptized their children, celebrated new festivals, and began to view life and death through the lens of salvation. At the same time, tensions arose between Christians and adherents of traditional gods, leading to debates, riots, and divisions. The empire, once united by its pantheon, now faced spiritual fragmentation. Constantine's ambitions extended beyond religion. Recognizing that Rome was no longer the ideal seat of power, he founded a new capital in the east, on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. He built Constantinople, a city of palaces, forums, and churches. Its location on the Bosporus gave strategic control over trade between Europe and Asia, and its defensible position ensured security. In 330 AD, Constantinople was dedicated as the new Rome, a city that would outlast the empire in the west by 1,000 years. This shift symbolized the growing importance of the eastern provinces. Wealth flowed from Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor, while the west struggled with declining agriculture and constant pressure from Germanic tribes. For citizens in Gaul, Spain, or Italy, the empire began to feel distant, its center of gravity moving eastward. While the Senate still convened in Rome, real power now resided in Constantinople. The unity Constantine forged, however, was fragile. After his death in 337 AD, his sons divided the empire among themselves, reviving old rivalries. Religious disputes further fractured society. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, convened by Constantine himself, had attempted to settle debates over the nature of Christ, affirming that he was of the same substance as the Father. Yet theological controversies continued, splitting communities between Nicene Christians and Arians. Faith, which had once united small groups of believers against persecution, now divided entire provinces. Daily life in the 4th century reflected these transitions. Citizens still filled amphitheaters, though gladiatorial games began to wane. Markets bustled with goods from across the Mediterranean. But economic troubles persisted, especially in the West. Taxes remained heavy, and many farmers fell into debt, finding themselves to their land in arrangements that foreshadowed medieval serfdom. The grandeur of Rome's monuments remained, yet behind the marble facades, poverty and inequality deepened. For the average Roman, religion became the most visible change. Pagan festivals continued, but Christian celebrations gained prominence. The cult of the emperor faded, replaced by devotion to saints and martyrs. Catacombs beneath Rome, once hidden places of burial and worship, became sacred sites visited openly. Families debated faith at their tables. Neighbors quarreled over doctrine, and bishops wielded influence that rivaled governors. The legions, too, felt the change. Soldiers now marched under the sign of the cross. Their loyalty tied not only to the emperor, but also to a faith that promised eternal life. Some officers resisted, clinging to the old gods, but over time, Christianity spread even through the ranks. This blending of military discipline with spiritual conviction gave the empire a new character, one that endured even as its political structures weakened. Constantine's reign thus marked a watershed, assured the empire's survival after years of division, but in doing so, he reshaped it beyond recognition. The Rome of Augustus, with its pagan temples and republican facade, gave way to a Christian empire with a new capital, new faith, and new identity. The eternal city remained, but its role diminished, overshadowed by Constantinople's rising star. As the 4th century progressed, the strains on the empire grew. The East flourished under strong emperors and rich provinces, but the West struggled against mounting threats. Germanic tribes pressed harder against the Rhine and Danube, while internal divisions sapped strength. The dream of unity so carefully built by Constantine, began to fray. The empire was still vast and mighty, but cracks were spreading once again. And beyond its borders, new peoples prepared to test its walls. The barbarian threat and fall in the west by the late 4th century, the empire stood divided. The east, with Constantinople as its gleaming capital, enjoyed wealth from trade routes in fertile provinces. The west, centered in Rome and later Ravenna, struggled with weaker resources, declining agriculture, and constant pressure along its frontiers. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine had preserved Rome's strength for a time, but new threats gathered beyond the Rhine and Danube, threats that would prove too great for the West to resist. For centuries, the empire had faced Germanic tribes pressing against its borders. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, and others had long been both enemies and allies, sometimes raiding, sometimes serving as mercenaries. Rome had often managed this balance, offering land and payment in exchange for peace. But in 376 AD, a storm of migration began that would overwhelm the Western Empire. That year, the Visigoths, fleeing the advance of the Huns from the steppes of Central Asia, sought refuge within Roman territory. Emperor Valens allowed them to cross the Danube and settle in the Balkans, but corruption and neglect led to disaster. Roman officials exploited the refugees, selling them dog meat at exorbitant prices and mistreating their families. Desperation turned to rebellion, and the Visigoths rose against Rome. The conflict culminated in 378 AD at the Battle of Adrianople, where Valens marched to meet the Gothic forces. Overconfident and without waiting for reinforcements, he engaged them. The result was a catastrophe. The Roman army was annihilated, Valens was killed, and the myth of Roman invincibility shattered. For the first time in centuries, a barbarian force had destroyed a Roman field army in open battle. The psychological blow was immense. After Adrianople, the empire could no longer treat the barbarians simply as external threats. Increasingly, emperors turned to treaties, granting them land within the empire as foederati, allied peoples bound to provide military service. While this strategy provided short-term stability, it planted seeds of division. The empire became a patchwork of Roman provinces and semi-autonomous barbarian settlements, eroding central authority. In 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, marched on Rome itself. For 3 days, his forces sacked the Eternal City. Though not utterly destroyed, the shock reverberated across the empire. Rome, the symbol of power and civilization, had fallen to foreign hands. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, captured the despair. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. For Romans, it felt as if the end of the world had begun. Daily life in the West grew harder. Trade routes that had once brought grain from Africa and luxuries from the East faltered under constant disruption. Cities shrank, their forums and theaters abandoned, their aqueducts falling into disrepair. Many citizens fled to the countryside, seeking safety in fortified villas or estates. The old urban rhythm of Roman life gave way to a more rural existence, a foreshadowing of medieval Europe. The Vandals, another Germanic people, crossed into Gaul and Spain before moving into North Africa. In 439 AD, they captured Carthage, Rome's ancient rival and vital source of grain, with North Africa in their hands. The Vandals controlled the Mediterranean's western trade. Their fleets raided Italian coasts and even sacked Rome again in 455 AD without African grain. The Western Empire starved. Meanwhile, the Huns, led by the fearsome Attila, descended upon both East and West, known as the Scourge of God. Attila terrorized Europe with swift raids, demanding tribute and leaving destruction in his wake. In 451 AD, a coalition of Romans and Visigoths managed to halt him at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in Gaul. But the victory was costly and temporary. The following year, Attila invaded Italy, only turning back after negotiations with Pope Leo I, though Attila's death in 453 spared the empire further devastation. His campaigns had drained Rome's already fragile strength. Amid these storms, leadership in the West faltered. Weak emperors rose and fell, often controlled by generals or court factions. The true power increasingly lay with military strongmen, such as Stilicho, a capable general of Vandal descent, who defended the empire until his execution in 408 AD, later came Hideus, known as the last of the Romans, who masterminded the defense against Attila. Yet even these men could only delay the inevitable. The West no longer had the resources, manpower, or unity to restore its strength. For ordinary Romans, these years were a struggle for survival. Taxes rose to fund endless wars, yet protection grew uncertain. Soldiers recruited from barbarian tribes often showed more loyalty to their own leaders than to Rome. Cities like Trier, Arles, and Milan, once centers of administration, shrank or fell to invaders. The grandeur of Rome's past, its baths, amphitheaters, and temples stood as crumbling reminders of a vanished age. Religion became a source of both hope and division. Christianity, now firmly established as the state faith, offered consolation in the face of disaster. Bishops rose in influence, guiding communities and negotiating with barbarian kings. The church became a stabilizing force, preserving learning, providing charity, and sustaining a sense of order. Yet theological disputes, such as the Arian controversy, also created rifts. Many of the Germanic tribes who entered the empire were Arian Christians, differing from Nicene orthodoxy, which complicated relations with Roman populations. By the mid-5th century, the Western Empire had become a shadow of its former self. Its emperors ruled more in name than in fact, reliant on barbarian generals who wielded real power. The East, though pressured, endured thanks to its wealth and defensible capital in Constantinople. But the West, beset on all sides, crumbled piece by piece. Provinces, once firmly Roman Britain, Gaul, Spain, Africa, lost to new kingdoms, each ruled by former enemies turned settlers. Tamed, the Roman world was changing irreversibly. Still standing remained a symbol of memory and faith. But the empire that had ruled the Mediterranean for centuries was dying. Its people, clinging to traditions and religion, endured the transition into a new age. The fall was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, painful transformation as Rome yielded to the weight of history. And a new Europe began to take shape upon its ruins. Final collapse and aftermath by the mid-5th century. The Western Roman Empire was a little more than a fragile shell of its former glory. The emperors, who still wore the purple in Ravenna, Rome's new capital in the West, ruled in name but not in power. Their authority was undermined by powerful generals, shifting alliances, and the constant presence of barbarian warlords who now occupied lands once firmly Roman. Provinces that had fed and sustained Rome were gone, leaving the empire starved, vulnerable, and isolated. Britain, abandoned by imperial troops in the early 400s, fell to Saxons and local warlords. Gaul, once the jewel of Roman strength under Caesar, was carved into kingdoms by the Franks and Visigoths. Spain, too, fell under Visigothic control. The Vandals, having seized North Africa, held Rome's grain supply hostage and turned Carthage into the center of their sea-borne empire. Without its richest provinces, the Western Empire lacked the resources to recover. The emperors themselves became little more than pawns. In 455 AD, after the assassination of Valentinian III, Rome descended into further chaos. The Vandals sacked the Eternal City once again, carrying away treasures that had adorned its temples and forums for centuries. The sack was brutal but symbolic, a clear signal that Rome could no longer protect its own heart. In this vacuum of power, generals of barbarian origin rose as kingmakers. Ricimer of Swabi descent became the most powerful figure in the West during the mid-5th century. Though he never claimed the throne, he elevated and deposed emperors at will, treating the imperial office as a mere tool. Ordinary citizens saw clearly that the empire's destiny no longer rested with Roman-born rulers, but with men whose ancestors had once been enemies. The final act came in 476 AD. At that time, the Western throne was held by a boy, Romulus Augustulus, whose very name seemed a cruel echo of Rome's beginnings. He had been placed on the throne by his father, Orestes, a general who sought to wield power through his child, Coy. But the soldiers who had once supported Orestes turned against him when he refused to grant them land in Italy. Led by Odoacer, a commander of Germanic origin, they revolted. Orestes was captured and executed. Soon after, Odoacer marched into Ravenna, the western capital. Romulus Augustulus, still in his teens, was forced to abdicate. Unlike so many emperors before him, he was spared death, instead sent into quiet retirement near Naples. His fall marked the end of the line. The boy who bore the names of Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor became its last ruler in the West. With the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, Odoacer declared himself king of Italy. He did not claim the title of emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia, the diadem and purple robes, to Constantinople, acknowledging the Eastern emperor as the sole ruler of Rome. In doing so, Odoacer symbolically ended the Western Roman Empire. What had begun with Augustus nearly 5 centuries earlier came to its conclusion in quiet submission, not with a bang of conquest, but with the fading of legitimacy. Yet life, for many, did not change overnight. Farmers still tilled their fields, merchants still traded, and cities still functioned. The new rulers in Italy, Gaul, and Spain were less destroyers than successors. They adopted Roman laws, Roman titles, and even Roman religion. The Vandals in Africa minted coins with Roman symbols. The Visigothic kings in Spain styled themselves as protectors of Roman tradition. Odoacer himself governed Italy with the cooperation of the Senate, preserving a semblance of continuity. What ended in 476 was not the lived experience of Rome as people, but the central authority of the Western imperial office. The great monuments of the Eternal City still stood, though some lay in ruin. The Senate still met, though its power was ceremonial. The Church, however, grew stronger, filling the vacuum of authority. Bishops became leaders not only of faith, but also of communities, negotiating with barbarian kings, organizing aid, and preserving the memory of Rome's greatness. The Eastern Roman Empire, which came to be known as the Byzantine Empire, continued. From Constantinople, emperors ruled over Greece, Asia Minor, the Levant, and Egypt, preserving Roman law, administration, and culture. In time, Byzantine armies under Justinian would even attempt to reconquer the lost western provinces. But in 476, the distinction was clear. The West had fallen, while the East endured. For Romans who lived through this transformation, emotions were complex. Some mourned the loss of imperial unity, recalling the grandeur of Augustus and Trajan, the wealth of the Pax Romana, the games and spectacles that once defined Roman pride. Others accepted the change as survival, adapting to new rulers while preserving old traditions. Roman identity did not vanish, but it evolved, blending with the cultures of Goths, Vandals, and Franks to create something new. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a single event, but a process stretching across generations. From the crisis of the 3rd century to the sack of Rome in 410, from the loss of Africa in 439 to the abdication of Romulus Augustulus in 476. Each step marked the slow erosion of power. Yet, the idea of Rome to dream of a civilization bound by law, order, and culture proved more enduring than its emperors. In the centuries that followed, medieval kings would claim the mantle of Rome. The church would preserve its language and learning, and Constantinople would carry its legacy into the Middle Ages. Even in ruin, Rome shaped the world that came after. The fall of the empire was the birth of a new age, one in which the memory of Rome served as both guide and ghost for generations to come. Reflection and Roman legacy. When Romulus Augustulus was deposed in 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire ended as a political reality, yet Rome itself did not vanish. Its laws, culture, language, and memory lived on, echoing across centuries. The fall of Rome was less a sudden collapse than a transformation, the slow passing of one world into another. To understand Rome's legacy, one must look not only at what ended, but also at what endured us. In the centuries that followed, the city of Rome became the spiritual center of Christianity. The Bishop of Rome, later known as the Pope, grew into a figure of immense influence. As emperors and kings rose and fell, the papacy endured, carrying the weight of Roman identity into the medieval world. The Church preserved Latin, administered laws, and kept alive the memory of Roman order. For many across Europe, to be civilized meant to be connected to Rome through the Christian faith. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, remained for nearly 1,000 more years. Its capital, Constantinople, stood as a beacon of wealth and learning. Byzantine emperors continued to call themselves Romans, and their subjects saw themselves as heirs to Augustus and Constantine. They preserved Roman law in the great codification of Justinian, which became the foundation of legal systems in Europe centuries later. They maintained Roman military traditions, engineering, and administration, even as their empire adapted to Greek language and culture. Meanwhile, the memory of Rome haunted the rulers of the West. In 800 AD, when Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans, the act symbolized the enduring pull of Roman prestige. Later still, the Holy Roman Empire claimed descent from Rome, a political fiction that lasted until the early modern era. Kings and emperors across Europe sought legitimacy by cloaking themselves in Roman titles, laws, and symbols. The eagle, the fasces, the very word Caesar echoed in languages as Kaiser and Tsar, reminders of the empire that had once united the Mediterranean. In daily life, Roman legacies remained woven into the fabric of Europe. Latin evolved into the Romance language, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian spoken by millions today. Roman architecture influenced medieval builders whose arches and domes drew from ancient designs. Roman roads, though weathered, still shaped the map of Europe, guiding trade and travel for centuries. Even the calendar, reformed by Julius Caesar, continued to mark the passage of time. Yet Rome's legacy was not only in structures and systems, it was also in ideas. The Roman concept of citizenship, though reshaped by centuries, influenced later notions of belonging and identity. The Roman Republic, though long gone, inspired thinkers in the Renaissance and Enlightenment, who looked to its mixed constitution as a model for liberty and governance. The United States Senate, the idea of checks and balances, the language of republic and democracy, all drew from Rome's example. At the same time, Rome's decline carried lessons that echoed across history. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, the overextension of military commitments, the reliance on mercenaries, the erosion of civic duty, and the corruption of political lifefall was seen by later generations as warnings. Historians debated whether Rome fell because of decadence, external invasion, or internal weakness. Each answer reflected the concerns of the age. For Rome's story became a mirror in which later societies saw their own fears and hopes. For the people who lived through Rome's fall, the experience was not abstract, but deeply personal. A farmer in Gaul might have seen Roman tax collectors replaced by Frankish lords. A merchant in Spain might have paid duties to Visigothic rulers instead of imperial officials. A citizen in Rome might have watched the Senate still convene, even as emperors disappeared. To them, the fall was not the end of civilization, but a change of masters, a shift in the rhythms of life. Yet, the memory of Rome as a golden age lingered, shaping how they understood their present. in the eternal city itself, ruins became reminders. The Colosseum, once filled with gladiators and cheering crowds, slowly crumbled, its stones reused for medieval fortresses and churches. The Forum, once the beating heart of politics, became a pasture for cattle. Yet pilgrims still came to Rome, not to see emperors, but to visit the tombs of saints, walking streets where triumphal processions had once passed. The city endured, transformed from capital of an empire to capital of faith. Rome's story is one of resilience as much as decline. It rose from a cluster of huts on the Tiber to command the known world. It endured kings, republic, and emperors, reinventing itself time and again. Its fall in the West was real, but its spirit survived in laws, languages, and institutions. To this day, the idea of Rome remains powerful. Writers, rulers, and dreamers invoke its name, whether as a warning, an inspiration, or a symbol of greatness. Standing among its ruins today, one can still feel the weight of history. The stones of the Colosseum, the columns of the Forum, the roads stretching into the countryside, the whisper of an age when Rome's legions marched. Its citizens debated, and its emperors dreamed of eternity. The empire fell, yet the city lives, and its legacy shapes our world. The fall of Rome was not the end of history, but the beginning of a new chapter. In its place arose kingdoms, cultures, and faiths that carried pieces of Rome forward. Its story is not simply of rise and fall, but of transformation, continuity, and memory. To understand Rome is to understand the foundations of the world we inhabit, for in our laws, our languages, our cities, and our dreams, Rome is still with us.